Hey everybody, Rob Childs here, Rapier Swordsman out of the United States, and I am coming to you in this video with another sword fighting truth bomb. Now, this particular topic of conversation comes from another conversation that was happening online between two individuals who were discussing what I call the Notel lunge versus the sword and the body leaving at the same time. On the one side, you've got the individual who believes that every attack should be led by the sword leading the way and then following with the body. The other individual believing that all of that is unnecessary and that what you should be doing is that the sword and the body leaves at the same time on every one of those attacks. Now, over the course of this conversation, the individual who believes in the sword and the body moving at the same time brought my name into the conversation, saying that, hey, even Rob Childs does it this way. He very rarely ever does anything with the sword leading the way. Well, that's not entirely accurate. In fact, it's not even close to accurate. What would have been accurate to say is that Rob Childs doesn't do it every single time. Allow me to explain. Anybody who's ever learned from me in person knows that I am a huge proponent of what I call the Notel lunge, whereby the sword leads the way on the attack, then followed by the body once you reach extension. But that is not to say that you're going to use that every single time. Now, the two individuals that were having this conversation were arguing with each other back and forth about what you should do on every one of these attacks. Well, for me, what is actually true is that I use both. And the reason for that is because my opponents are all different people and they're presenting me with different problem sets of a defense. Now, if I have a key to a lock and it works in this one particular lock, that doesn't mean that key is going to work in every single other lock that I come across. Instead, just like in sword fighting, you're going to have an opponent who is going to be presenting you, fencer A is going to present one type of defense, fencer B is going to present another, and C still something entirely different. Now, while it is indeed a valuable tool, and I use it a lot, the Notel lunge, that is not to say that I'm going to use that every single time. Now, those instances when I'm not using it, when I am indeed moving the sword and the body at the same time, is usually because whatever it is that my opponent is presenting to me as a defense, I am feeling more secure and more safe when I execute in such fashion that my sword stays between me and my opponent's weapon. Now, the only way I'm going to be able to do that is by moving the sword and the body at the same time, so that way I can keep my body behind the defensive posture of my weapon. But that, again, is not to say that there are not instances, and they can switch in a fraction of a second as to which one you're going to use over the other. That is not to say that you're not going to be using that Notel lunge a lot, and I do. Just going over the video footage from the last tournament that I was in out in the Midwest, I came across 9 different instances before I stopped looking entirely. And what I'm going to do with you now is I'm going to, through the magic of slow motion video, I'm going to clear up what I think might be some of the vagaries that exist with regard to what actually is a Notel lunge. Because there are things that I do, at its most basic, yes, sword leads the way, and then the body follows behind that. But in the midst of a sword fight, there are a lot of things going on, and I do other things in the midst of or just before executing that Notel lunge. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go over some of those instances. I'm going to show you some of the most basic examples of the Notel lunge, and then we're going to go through some, shall we say, evolutions of that, or I should say adaptations that I utilize in the course of fencing against, well, a wide variety of different types of opponents. And maybe then that will help not just this person who brought my name into the conversation, but all of you as well to understand what is and is not a Notel attack. Okay, so here first we're going to go over what I call a classic Notel lunge. At the way it looks, first at full speed, and then we'll go into it at slow motion. So here's what I call that classic example, your stereotypical, picture-perfect Notel lunge, starting with the sword and then following with the body. Here's first at full speed. Now, did you catch that, or did it happen too quickly? Just in case, I'll show it to you again. Here we are again at full speed with a Notel lunge, what it looks like. Now, we're going to go into this at slow motion, so that way you can actually see the breakdown of the first part of the Notel lunge and then followed by the second part of the Notel lunge. This one is one of the slower Notel lunges that I could find for the purposes of being able to be as clear as possible. So have yourself a gander at this while I'm standing in front of my opponent. We start to get the feel for each other, getting the sense of the measure, and then you'll see my front foot comes down into position. My back foot starts to come up while the tip of my sword starts to rise. Now, the tip of the sword is rising because it's preparing. It's the sword first maneuver part of the no-tail lunge. My back foot is moving at the same time because it is getting into position, preparing to launch. So again, you can see here, tip is rising, back foot's in position, and then from here, I launch at my opponent, striking them, giving them the least amount of time possible for them to respond to what it is that I am doing. So here we have another example, but in this instance, this one is going to address some of the issues, I think, that confuses people as to whether or not something is or is not the sword moving first, vice the sword and the body moving at the same time. I have on many occasions had people ask me about a certain clip that they saw and saying, oh, well, your body and your sword are moving at the same time, and yet you called this a no-tail lunge. No, what they were confusing was the propulsion forward. The propulsion forward that carries you into the lunge, that is the part that makes up the second half of a no-tail lunge. But as you're about to see here in this instance, it is an adjustment of the foot. It is not me moving forward while my sword is rising up and getting the alignment that I want in order to then launch against my opponent. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a moment. So first, I'm going to play it at full speed. See if you can pick up on these slight adjustments with your own eyes at regular speed. So did you catch that? If not, I'll play it one more time, and then we'll break it down in the slow-mo. So in this instance, I adjusted my foot just before I launch into it. And here, you're going to see it now in slow motion, make it a lot easier for you to pick up on. Now, in this moment right now, we're just simply getting the gauge of each other. My foot backs up a little bit, and then I do two things at the same time. But this is not body and sword moving at the same time. This is instead, my foot is going to adjust, getting in the proper position for the launch. And while my foot is adjusting, you'll see my tip starting to rise up and get the alignment that I want, the trajectory line that I want to launch into the second half of the no-tail lunge. So here you see my foot starts to move to adjust. My tip is rising up. Once I get the alignment that I want, and I've gotten as far or as high, I should say, the tip getting as high as I can, in this particular instance, because of the way that my opponent is holding his sword, I start the second half of the no-tail lunge a little sooner than I could have in another situation. I could have certainly extended my arm even further, but in this instance, my opponent is presenting something in alignment with his sword in such a fashion that I can, or I should say, I want to keep my sword between me and his weapon, and that is exactly what I do when I go into the launch, propelling myself forward and striking my opponent unexpectedly, giving him, of course, the least amount of time to respond possible. Again, my foot adjusts while my tip is rising, and then once I'm where I want it to be, I launch forward into the attack, and my opponent is struck by my no-tail lunge. So here in this third clip that I've taken from yet another bout in that exact same tournament, you're going to see a convoluting of or I should say rather, really an integration of different techniques happening at the same time while I am preparing to launch into my no-tail lunge. So as before, first I show it to you at full speed. Again, I want to go back to it, let you see it one more time at full speed. Now we're going to break this down at slow motion so that way you can see the individual components, the blending of techniques that I utilize in this particular exchange. So watch how, as I move, I take my advanced step forward in order to close measure. My opponent backs off, wisely so, but then he comes forward, and then I begin my false advance. Now, if you've never seen the technique on the false advance, there is a video on the public YouTube channel that speaks to this. If you're wanting to learn more about that, please go to that. But for now, you see my foot as it's going forward into the false advance, and before my foot has even touched down, you see my sword starting to rise, moving in the first part of the no-tail lunge, because in that, the sword leads the way. The sword starts going up, And as soon as I am far enough, and again, you'll notice the posture of my opponent is similar in the previous clip as to that opponent. So in this instance, I'm going to launch in such a fashion that combines my no-tell lunge with also keeping my sword between me and my opponent's weapon. I fly forward on the actual attack itself, strike my opponent, keeping my sword between me and his weapon, and I strike him, get away, he swings futilely at the air. So again, you'll see it here. First is my actual advance toward him. He backs off, he comes forward, and then in order to keep his defenses as low as possible, to keep him calm so that way he doesn't believe there's an impending attack, I do a false advance, and before that foot even touches down, my sword is in motion heading toward him, and then I launch and make my strike. So in this fourth and final clip, like I said, I was going through all of the footage and I had 9 instances of the no-tell lunge that I used before I stopped looking because clearly I was using it a great deal at this tournament. But in this fourth and final clip, it's very similar to the previous one, whereby I utilized 2 different techniques at the same time, one blending into the other. So in this case, I was using another false advance, and for those of you who have fenced me before, you know that this is a favorite of mine because it keeps my opponent's defenses down while I'm actually closing that distance just a little bit more to launch into the main attack. But in this instance here, I'm going to show you again, a couple of times at full speed, and then we'll break it down in slow motion. Now let's do that again. See if you can pick up the individual components at full speed just with your eyes alone. Now, let's break it down at the slow motion. Like I said, it's very similar to the technique, the tactic that I utilized against the opponent in the previous clip. But here you're going to see, as I am closing the distance with my opponent, going forward right now, I'm stepping in the false advancement. Now you'll notice, I am raising the tip, moving the sword toward my opponent, getting the alignment that I want, and as soon as my foot comes down, I launch, striking him in the arm. And again, this is all done with a no-tell lunge whereby the sword is leading the way. If I can reduce the amount of time that my opponent has to respond to my attack, even by a fraction of a second, in fencing, we are all operating according to fractions of a second. If I get even 1 fraction ahead of my opponent, that is advantage me. And in this particular instance, as I did in the other instances, the no-tell lunge was instrumental to me in order to reduce the amount of time that my opponent has to respond to the incoming attack. The key thing to take away from all of this is that the no-tell lunge itself is a technique, and as such, you can utilize that technique with other techniques in order to create an offense that is truly adaptive and is responding to what it is that your opponent is presenting to you as a defense. Now, not every situation is going to require a no-tell lunge. Some instances are going to require, in fact, that your body and sword move at the same time. It's dependent upon what your opponent is presenting to you. But nonetheless, I am a huge proponent of and use all the time the no-tell lunge precisely because of the advantage that it gives me in keeping my opponent down to the minimum time possible to respond to my attacks.